Hey friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and I want to thank all of you for answering the poll that I put in the community notes section last weekend. As you guys know, we are in the middle of the Three Rivers Challenge. This is the pantry challenge that I do every January and February, where I document all of the meals we're making throughout the week for you here in my videos. And you can see the first 3 weeks of the challenge in my last 3 videos. But as you guys know, we don't always cook new meals every time we eat. And so I felt like I needed a week where maybe I didn't have to think about making creative meals, and I could maybe be redundant a little bit. And, some of the kids were saying, hey, we want spaghetti again, or hey, we would like to have a pot roast again. And I didn't want to share, I guess, meals that I had just shared with you in the previous weeks. So I thought it would be wonderful to take a week off of sharing meals, even though you guys know if you follow me on Instagram, I'm still sharing them there. And maybe share something else that we're doing during the pantry challenge. So I've given you several options, and overwhelmingly here on YouTube, you guys said you wanted to see some of the winter preserving that I've been doing. So that's what I'm going to bring you in this video. Just because it's a pantry challenge, it doesn't mean that we aren't also stocking up on food. You think of a pantry challenge, people usually think of depleting your stores, but part of a pantry challenge is looking in the freezer and maybe finding projects and things that you need to do to refill the jars that you're emptying. For example, we have a lot of bones in the freezer from some of the cattle that we have processed over the last year. And those bones have just been sitting there. And during the busy gardening and preserving seasons last fall, where I was focusing on produce, the bones just kind of sat there. And now I have a bunch of empty jars sitting on the counter. Why not use the pantry challenge to clear those bones out of the freezer, turn them into broth, get them in jars, and stock the pantry back up with broth? And so there are lots of different projects like that have just kind of been sitting there waiting for me to tackle them. And last weekend, I looked at the number of empty jars I had sitting in my kitchen. And I was like, okay, this is the week that I need to tackle this. And so I was really happy that that was what you guys chose out of the poll, because that's really what I wanted to do this week. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to share with you all of the winter preserving projects that I was able to accomplish in the last week. And we'll be doing a lot more preserving over the next couple of months, but I'll try to kind of squeeze it into these videos within the pantry challenge. All of the other options that you guys had asked for me to make videos about on the poll, don't worry, those will be coming in other weeks of the pantry challenge. And next week I'll be back to sharing another week of different meals. But as for now, we're going to go ahead and get into some canning and preserving. Let's go ahead and get started. If you've been around here for a while, you know that every week begins with a pretty detailed meal plan. This is absolutely necessary for me with homeschooling and everything in my days. If I don't keep a detailed plan of all of the work that needs done and all of the meals that I'm going to make, things will just get pushed aside and I'll forget about them, and then the meals won't get made and I'll be rushed around mealtime to get something on the table. So I have a link to this planner in the video description that kind of shows how I set this up for myself. This week I also made a list of all of the preservation projects that I would like to complete. And then, as always, I needed to go down to the cellar to shop for everything that I need to complete my meal plan for the week. And this is what it looked like. You can see that each week we're emptying lots of jars, and this isn't even including things that are in the freezer that are in jars that are getting frozen. So we're accumulating quite a bit of empties in the kitchen. Have to keep my inventory up to date, so everything that comes out of the cellar is taken off of the list. All right, the first preservation project that I needed to tackle this week was to finish the lemons. If you guys remember, in December we received our yearly bulk citrus order, and in that order there were 4 bushel boxes of lemons, and I've been working on preserving them. I've shown you in previous videos how I was freeze drying slices of lemons, and we put those in tea and all sorts of beverages, iced tea, all throughout the summer. And then I was also freezing the juice from these lemons into pint jars to make homemade lemonade. But with this last batch of lemons here, I decided I was going to juice them, but then freeze them in a different way for different purposes. This will not be for lemonade, but there are some recipes sometimes that just call for a couple tablespoons of lemon juice, and I don't want to have to thaw a whole pint for that purpose. So I have these silicone trays from Supercubes, and I'll link them for you in the description, and they are perfect for freezing small quantities of juice like this. I love them because they come with lids, and then I can just stack them in the freezer and freeze up. I use these a lot for herbs, for pureed garlic, whatever it is that I want to put in small quantities in the freezer. And then because they're silicone, they just pop right out. It's so convenient and easy to freeze things this way. So this was my first project of the week, and I got the rest of those lemons finally preserved, and they're in the freezer to use for later. Now, the next pressing project this week was to work on onions. These are our homegrown onions. They were Patterson onions that we grew last summer. We harvested them, cured them, and got them in storage, and they've been doing really well up to this point. But I noticed last week when I was cutting up onions that some of them are starting to go soft, and they're all going to go bad if I don't do something with them here soon. So I took 2 of the 3 bags that were left, and I chopped them up and got them on freeze dryer trays. And we're going to just freeze dry these, and then they can be powdered down into onion powder, or they can be rehydrated and used just like fresh sliced onions in whatever recipes we want. Now, if you don't have a freeze dryer, you can do this with a dehydrator. That's what I did before we had a freeze dryer, and it works just the same. The only difference is that sometimes when you use the dehydrator to do this, it can smell pretty oniony in your house, whereas with the freeze dryer, it seems to kind of trap the odor so you don't have to deal with that. But either way, you can get those onions dried, and then they won't go bad in storage. And so once they were completely dried, I'm just putting them in jars because I know we're going to use these onions up in the next month or two. If I had way more onions that I was doing, I would probably take some of these and put them in Mylar for more long-term storage. And but for now, I know that this isn't a whole lot of onions. I'm just going to put them in jars and keep them up in the kitchen. And then when I am cooking something, I can just open the jar and shake it into the pot. Or like I said, I could take a whole jar, I could throw it in the food processor or blender and blend it down into onion powder. Now you may be wondering how we only have 3 bags of onions left. Well, besides using them a lot in our cooking, I preserved the majority of them last fall through other canning projects. One of the ways was making a French onion soup base with beef broth, and I did several batches of that, and that just got the onions into jars. So I decided that the next way I'm going to preserve the last bag of onions is to be making a ham and bean soup base. So I started by grabbing 3 ham hocks out of the freezer. These are fresh hocks that aren't cured in any way, so this is just no seasonings at all. I put 3 of them in the roaster and then added water, and then I'm just going to roast that for about 24 hours. And then the next day I have a nice ham broth. Now I intentionally just put water because we are going to season this broth as it goes into the jars. But I can't do that until this meat cools down a little bit so that I can pick it all off of the bones and get to work with it. So while I was doing school with the kids, I let this cool down for a little bit, washed out 7 quart jars, and then I can get to work. So like I said, this is going to be a ham and bean I guess a base for ham and bean soups, and all of the seasonings and flavorings that I would want to put into a ham and bean soup or something like a split pea soup will go into the jar that I'm canning my onions and broth with, and then it will just make a really easy dump and go soup base. So let me show you how I'm doing this. The first thing I did is I put 1 garlic clove into each jar. And now our homegrown garlic is also in storage, and it's doing okay. It wasn't as pressing to preserve that at this point as the onions, but I do know that at some point in the next couple of weeks, I'm probably going to need to preserve
not the next couple of weeks, probably in the next month, I'm going to need to preserve the garlic that we have in storage in the same way that I did the onions here. So I'll probably be freeze drying a lot of that to make garlic powder, or pureeing it and putting it in the freezer to make little garlic pucks that I've shown you before. But the onions were more pressing at this point, and we're focusing on that. So along with the garlic clove that I put in the bottom of each of these jars, I'm chopping up about 1 onion each into the jar. This is pretty much the same process that I used for making the French onion soup base, just stuffing the jars full of onions and then covering it with whatever other seasonings and spices, and then putting your broth in, and then you have a good base for a soup. But we are going to add meat this time because ham hocks have a lot of meat on them. They're different than beef bones that I used for beef bone broth. I added a little bit of parsley to each jar, and then I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of salt to each, and then they're ready to be packed with the meat from these ham hocks. So I'm just going to get to work here, digging all of the meat out from the bones here and separating it. I'm making sure to pull off any extra fat. If you have a lot of fat in your jars, they are at risk if there is any kind of siphoning that happens during the canning process. If that fat gets up over the rim of the jar, between the rim and the lid, that will prevent a good seal. And so anytime I'm canning meat like this, I want to remove as much fat as possible for that specific reason. But any of the fat and little bits of meat that I miss that are left over will be saved and will be fed to the chickens, and they will absolutely love that during this winter time where it's cold. That's a little extra protein and nutrition to keep them warm. Now that we've filled the jars with our meat, we're just going to top it off with that plain ham broth, and filling each jar up as much as possible in order to make our ham and bean soup mix. So typically when I make ham and beans, I will put a ham hock in the crock pot with my dried beans and a bunch of water and all of these, the onion and garlic that I put in the jars here, and we'll let it cook for a long time. But all I'll have to do when I want to do it now with these jars is dump one of these jars into a pot with a jar of cooked beans, and it's all ready to go. I'll just have to warm it up. So that'll be super convenient. Just taking a minute to debubble those jars since they were packed pretty tightly, and then adjust the head spaces as needed to leave about 1 inch on each jar, making sure to wipe the rims of those because, like I said, they can be pretty greasy. Now we're going to add our lids. These are my 4 jars canning lids. If you would like 10% off some quality canning lids, check out the link in the description. You guys know I can pretty much exclusively with these lids. I've been doing so for over 2 years now, and out of all of the jars that I've been pulling out of the pantry to use, I have had 0 lid failures with these canning lids. So they are really good quality, and you can get a discount. Check out that link. We're going to put these in the pressure canner and process for 90 minutes. We're treating this like a meat soup. So 90 minutes in the pressure canner. When we're done, we have a wonderful soup base for lots of different things. Ham and beans that I mentioned. We could also make split pea soup that I'm going to show you here in a minute how I will use that. But we did have some leftover broth. I went ahead and saved some of that in the big jar to put in the fridge, and we canned up these other pints here, and we can use these, add these to the pantry shelves, and any other time we're making a soup that we want to add ham broth to, these will be available for. As I mentioned, besides ham and beans, making split pea soup with one of these soup bases is going to be so easy. So I had some split peas and lentils soaking overnight with a little bit of lemon juice, and then I drained them after I woke up in the morning, and we're going to go ahead and add those to the pot. A lot of people ask why I soak things like legumes and grains and other things, and that is not only does it help it cook faster, but it also helps increase the digestibility of those items. So here is 1 of the quarts of that soup base. Remember, this has all of the flavoring that this pot of soup is going to need. It has the onion and the garlic and the parsley and the salt. And then what I'll do to add to it, here is a quart of leftover pork roast drippings from earlier in the week. This has all of the fat and flavor from that roast, as well as all of the seasonings that I had put on the roast. And so that, in addition to the soup base, will be more than enough flavor for the soup. So I don't have to really add anything else. Now I could if I wanted to, if I had leftover potatoes, if I wanted to chop up some carrots, I could add anything else to this. But all I'm really doing is adding a little extra water to get everything out of those jars that I just opened. I did add the rest of that broth from the big jar that I had put in the fridge. And then all I'm going to need to do is stir this up and get it on the stove. And I have, look, a quick and easy meal that took me, 5 minutes to put together. And that'll be ready for us for lunch right after school. So this is why I do the canning of a lot of my soup bases. It makes for the easiest, convenient lunches during the winter. All right, next project. We're done with the onions. So the next most important thing to focus on this week are these apples. You guys saw in a video last fall how we had preserved these apples from Adam's grandpa's orchard. We had put them in bags and put them out in our overflow fridge in the garage. Now, when the cold snap happened a couple weeks ago, all of these froze. It slipped my mind. Now, we have some here that still look absolutely perfect, but a lot of them froze, and you could see that the outsides of them got really wrinkly, and that makes me so sad. We went to so much work to get these stored up so that we would have fresh apples to eat until March, hopefully. But no worries. They're not ruined. We can still salvage these and turn them into something else. The reason why we won't keep them in the fridge to use for fresh eating is that once they thaw, the insides of them will get kind of mushy. And I don't know about you guys, but I really don't enjoy the taste of an apple with that mushy texture. You may be asking why we didn't move these apples down to our cellar this year, and that's because in October, when we got these from the orchard, the cellar was still somewhere between 50 to 60 degrees, and that just really isn't optimal for the longevity of the apples. The fridge out there kept them at about 34 degrees, which was pretty perfect for these. So what I should have done is in December when the temperature dropped and the cellar was around 40 degrees or so, I should have moved them all downstairs. And it just slipped my mind with the busyness of December. And then we got those below zero temperatures over the last couple of weeks, and everything froze out there. So now we know next year I'm going to put it in my calendar to remind myself to move the apples to the cellar in December before it gets really cold here in Ohio. But that's okay. We're salvaging them by taking the cores, removing the cores, and just throwing the washed apples into our big roasting pan. Now we can cook these down into applesauce, apple butter. We could bake with these, make apple pie filling, anything like that. And we are not going to let these go to waste. Speaking of waste, you guys know I will not waste those cores either. I have many videos showing how I turn apple scraps into either apple cider vinegar or apple scrap jelly. And we've been eating a lot of jelly that I need to replenish on my pantry shelves. So I intend to make apple scrap jelly out of all of these cores. But the problem is that making jelly requires some sugar. And I am kind of rationing sugar right now due to the pantry challenge. So what I can do in the meantime is throw these cores that are already pretty much frozen, throw them into a bag and put them back in the freezer. And then come March or April when I go to replenish my sugar stores after the pantry challenge, I'll pull this bag out and we'll make a big batch of apple scrap jelly then. But it just didn't make sense for me to can up jelly right now because it would pretty much deplete all of the sugar that I need in the coming weeks to make things like a birthday cake for my son and some of the other baking that I like to do. So no big deal. We will salvage these. I took all of the cores that were in good shape, that didn't have any bad spots on them or anything, and we tucked those away into the freezer for later. Now, when you put apples in a roaster like this, you do want to make sure to add some water to the bottom of the pan. You want to make sure that it's pretty much covered with water so that none of those apples stick and burn at the bottom. And then all of that extra water will eventually evaporate as they continue to cook. Now, I just had these roasting at about 200 degrees while we're working through schoolwork and going through and just kind of moving them around, making sure nothing is sticking, submerging some of the apples on the top so that they get cooked. And then once they were soft enough that they could be blended, I grabbed my immersion blender and I'm just going to work through, push them down, move them around, and get them all blended up. We are going to can these up with the peels. Now, I could have gotten out my food mill and worked them through that to remove the peels, but those peels have nutrition. We're just going to go ahead and blend them together. My children don't even notice. So my babies love applesauce. I can never keep enough in the house. Even Benji here, he's snacking on one of the few apples that are still in good shape that have a good texture. And we're just taking a break here. We were letting all of the extra water evaporate out of that sauce and let it get a little bit thicker. And then by later on that evening, I could go ahead and process these pint jars of applesauce. We're just getting the lids on these pint jars, and then they're going to process in the water bath canner for just 15 minutes. And then we have 9 more little pints to add to the pantry shelves. I like cooking or canning them in pints because 1 pint makes a batch of my applesauce loaf that I love to make for the kids. Now, we had all of this applesauce left over. After the kids snacked on a little bit of it, I decided to continue cooking it down on the stove to go ahead and make a batch of apple butter. To my apple butter, besides the cooked apples, I'm going to add a little bit of cinnamon. I'm also going to add some nutmeg and then also some ground cloves. You can add whatever spices you like. Anything that is good in an apple pie spice is also good in apple butter. And then you can see how nice and thick that apple butter got. We're going to can this up into little pint jars and process that also for 15 minutes in the water bath. And a lot of people don't know what apple butter is. It's just a spreadable thing, like almost like an apple jam, I guess, but it's pureed down. We spread it on toast. It's great to put on pork chops. I'll sometimes make cinnamon rolls and then use this in the filling. Next project. We have a steer that is going to the butcher in April. I have a whole freezer I need to clear out before that can happen, and these 2 big bags of pork fat were taking up space. So I got my roaster all cleaned out from the apples, and we are just going to toss these frozen bags of fat straight into that roaster. Now, if this was leaf lard that was really good quality lard, I would have thawed this first and ground it down before I'm going to melt it, but this is not lard like that. This is just regular, it's going to be kind of porky flavored anyways. So I just added a little water to the bottom of the roaster, let it melt in the roaster, and then once it was thawed, I could kind of cut it up. Some of you might not know the difference between a leaf lard and a regular lard. The leaf lard is the area around the kidneys. It is really good for baking because it's kind of tasteless, odorless. It doesn't have that porky flavor, but this is just the fat from other areas that were attached to the meat. It's going to have a porky flavor no matter what I do. So all day long while we're doing school here, while I'm hanging out with the kids, that fat is melting down. And you can see later on in the day, there's enough of it melted that I could start ladling it off of the top and filling my jars. Now, I've done an entire video for you guys before that I'll link in the description, all about fat. The process for rendering tallow is basically the same, whether it's tallow, which is the fat from cows, sheep, those types of animals, or lard, which is the fat from a pig. They both are just such healthy foods. You can see how it's kind of a yellow color when it is a liquid. And as this hardens and solidifies and cools overnight, it's going to turn a beautiful snow white color. Just 12 hours later, you can see it's still a little liquidy, but it's starting to turn white. Now, the reason why this is so healthy for you is because it is the highest dietary source of vitamin D. And here in Ohio in the winter, we can't get vitamin D from the sun. We need to get it from animal fat. Now, lard is shelf stable at room temperature. You could just put it directly on the pantry shelves, but I like to store it in the overflow fridge on the top shelf here. I already have some tallow up there from our last cow that we processed. Adding the lard there, the colder you keep it, the longer the shelf life it has. So I find that I have the room here in the fridge. Why not keep it here? And it will last years in here for me, although it won't last that long because we will use it up before then. So that project is done. The next project I worked on this week is just filling up empty jars with the easiest things possible to can. One of those is berries to make some cranberry juice. So I've also done videos on this before. You can find, I just put the berries in the jar, fill it with water, and then we water bath can these quarts for about 15 minutes, and you end up with a cranberry juice. Now you can see the color on these is very weak immediately after canning. You let these sit for a while. You don't open them immediately, and the color will get richer. The flavor will get richer the longer they sit. But we use this juice for all sorts of things. This is just a really easy way. Instead of taking an empty jar downstairs to storage, put something in it like this. Another thing we did like that this week, see all those empties back there. We need to fill things. I grabbed some dried beans. I'll link my video on dried bean canning for you in the description. And these are black beans. I just need to fill jars, and it's really easy to fill beans this way in jars. It takes 90 minutes to pressure can them. They're just raw packed with water. And then I have cooked beans for really easy, convenient meals. I could add one of these jars of beans to one of those ham soup bases that I made earlier, and I have a wonderful meal. I'll just bake some cornbread and add it to that, and there we go. So we got 6 quarts of beans taken down to the pantry, and we are looking good here. Look at all of these jars that I was able to fill this week. Now we don't have any empties upstairs. I just need to get everything labeled properly. It feels really weird to be labeling jars with 2024 now. And then we're going to take these downstairs. You guys can see, oof, I do not like bringing things downstairs into the cellar. We are working on an indoor access because this outdoor steep stair situation is just not safe at all. We are going to work on that for next year. So this is the cycle of work on the homestead. Now that it's winter and things are slowing down, we are emptying jars by eating the work that we did last year, but also there are so many projects sitting in the freezers that I mentioned that could be preserved in much more convenient ways, and that is the focus of the work this time of year. Now, a lot of people ask, at what point will I let jars completely empty? Because obviously we're going to need empty jars for next year's growing season. And typically starting in about March or April, once I start focusing my energy towards the garden, that's the time that these jars will be completely emptied.
All right, guys, thank you so much for being here and watching our videos. I want to encourage you to check out the hashtag 3 Rivers Challenge. There are so many wonderful ladies and gentlemen who have been participating in this challenge with me. And if you click on the hashtag that is in this video title, up will pop up all of the other content creators who are also participating and sharing their content. So you might find some new wonderful accounts to follow, some encouragement, some meal ideas. That's what it's all about. So, all right, friends, we will see you next week. Bye.